Picture this. You're walking through the peaceful countryside of northeastern China on a crisp morning in 1940. The sun filters through bare winter branches as farmers tend to their fields. Children play in village squares while their mothers prepare breakfast. It's a scene of simple, everyday life. But just 40 miles away, behind electrified fences and concrete walls, something unthinkable is happening. In a sprawling complex larger than most cities, thousands of human beings are being systematically tortured, infected with deadly diseases, and murdered in the name of science. They call this place Unit 731, and what happened within its walls represents one of history's most horrific chapters of human experimentation. Today, we're going to walk through the daily reality of life inside Japan's most notorious biological warfare facility. We'll examine how ordinary people were transformed into test subjects, how a medical facility became a factory of death, and how an entire system was designed to strip away every trace of human dignity. This isn't just another war story. This is an exploration of how quickly civilization can collapse when ethics disappear and human beings become nothing more than laboratory materials. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge that what we're about to discuss contains disturbing content that some viewers may find difficult to hear. But these stories need to be told. The victims of Unit 731 deserve to have their experiences remembered, and we need to understand how such atrocities can happen so that we never allow them to occur again. The story begins in 1932, when Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii established what would become Japan's most ambitious biological weapons program. Ishii wasn't some fringe military figure operating in the shadows. He was a respected microbiologist, a decorated Army medical officer, and a man who commanded enormous resources from the Japanese government. The facility he created in Manchuria would eventually grow into a complex spanning 6 square kilometers, employing over 3,000 personnel and housing some of the most advanced medical equipment of its time. But here's what makes Unit 731 so particularly chilling. This wasn't a concentration camp built primarily for imprisonment or labor. This wasn't even a traditional military facility designed for conventional warfare. Unit 731 was purpose-built as a research institution where human beings would serve as test subjects for biological weapons development. Every aspect of its design, from the layout of the buildings to the daily routines of the staff, was engineered around the systematic use of human subjects for medical experimentation. The complex itself rivaled Auschwitz-Birkenau in size, but its appearance was deceptively ordinary. To local Chinese residents, it looked like an industrial facility, perhaps a lumber mill or manufacturing plant. The Japanese deliberately cultivated this impression, telling locals that the complex produced lumber for construction projects. This cover story would later take on a sinister meaning as researchers began referring to their human test subjects as maruta, meaning wooden logs in Japanese. Inside the administrative building sat a prison designed to hold up to 600 people at any given time. But these weren't traditional prison cells. The Japanese had designed this facility with medical experimentation in mind. Each cell contained wooden floors, basic toilet facilities, and carefully controlled ventilation systems that could be used to introduce gases or airborne pathogens. Guards could walk behind the cells through specially designed corridors, allowing them to observe prisoners without being seen. The selection of victims followed a systematic pattern that reveals the cold calculation behind Unit 731's operations. The Japanese military police, working closely with the Special Services Agency, scoured the streets of occupied Chinese cities for potential test subjects. They targeted anyone they deemed expendable. Chinese civilians, captured resistance fighters, political prisoners, and occasionally Russian and Mongolian captives. These people were loaded into black vans that locals called ravens and transported to the facility under cover of darkness. What happened next represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Unit 731's operations. Upon arrival, prisoners weren't immediately subjected to experiments. Instead, they were fed regular meals of rice, wheat, meat, and fish. Their health was carefully monitored by medical staff. They received adequate nutrition and basic medical care. This wasn't compassion, it was quality control. The Japanese understood that meaningful scientific data required healthy test subjects, so they maintained their human laboratory materials in optimal condition until experimentation began. Dr. Ishii had attracted some of Japan's most brilliant medical minds to his project. University professors, accomplished surgeons, and promising young researchers flocked to Unit 731, drawn by unprecedented research opportunities and generous government funding. The annual budget for the facility reached 10 million yen, equivalent to roughly $86 million in today's currency. Staff members enjoyed exceptional salaries, luxurious living conditions, and access to state-of-the-art medical equipment that many hospitals in Japan itself couldn't afford. But what kind of research was actually being conducted? The experiments fell into several broad categories, each more horrifying than the last. Disease research formed the core of Unit 731's activities. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, and dozens of other pathogens. Researchers would then monitor the progression of these diseases, taking detailed notes on symptoms, survival rates, and the effectiveness of various treatments. The facility maintained massive breeding operations for disease vectors. Unit 731 operated approximately 4,500 flea incubators, each capable of producing 45 kilograms of fleas per production cycle. These fleas were infected with plague bacteria and later deployed as biological weapons against Chinese civilian populations. In one documented attack on the village of Kuzhou, Japanese bombers released containers holding 30,000 infected fleas each. Witnesses described a fine reddish dust settling over the town, followed by an outbreak of painful flea bites. More than 2,000 civilians died in the resulting plague epidemic. Yoshimura Hisato, a physiologist working at Unit 731, specialized in hypothermia research. His experiments involved submerging prisoners' limbs in tubs of ice water until the flesh froze solid. He carefully timed how long it took for frostbite to develop, documenting the physical changes as human tissue crystallized. Witnesses later recalled that frozen limbs made a sound like wooden planks when struck with a cane. Hisato would then study the effects of rapid thawing, often repeating the freeze-thaw cycle multiple times on the same victim to observe the progression of tissue damage. Perhaps most disturbing were the vivisection experiments. Thousands of prisoners were subjected to live dissection without anesthesia. The stated purpose was to observe how diseases affected internal organs before decomposition could compromise the results. Prisoners would be strapped to operating tables while surgeons methodically removed organs, documenting their observations as victims screamed and struggled. To muffle the sounds, medical staff would stuff rags or gauze into prisoners' mouths before beginning the procedures. One former Unit 731 member described the process in chilling detail. As soon as symptoms were observed, the prisoners were taken from their cells and into the dissection room. He was stripped and placed on a table, screaming, trying to fight back. He was strapped down, still screaming frightfully. One of the doctors stuffed a towel into his mouth. Then, with one quick slice of the scalpel, he was opened up. The psychological impact on both victims and staff reveals another layer of Unit 731's horror. To cope with the cognitive dissonance of torturing human beings in the name of medical science, Researchers developed elaborate systems of dehumanization. Prisoners were never referred to as people or patients, only as maruta, or logs. Staff members would joke with each other, asking, "How many logs did you cut down today?" This linguistic distancing helped normalize the systematic murder of thousands of human beings. The facility's daily routine was designed around this dehumanization. Prisoners were identified by numbers rather than names. They wore identical clothing and were housed in identical cells. Medical examinations focused solely on their utility as experimental subjects. Their emotional states, their families, their hopes and fears were entirely irrelevant to their captors. They had been reduced to biological materials, no different from laboratory mice or cell cultures. But even within this system of absolute dehumanization, traces of human resistance occasionally surfaced. In one documented escape attempt, 2 Russian prisoners managed to overpower a guard who had entered their cell. They freed several other prisoners and attempted to fight their way out of the facility. One of the escapees, rather than face recapture, demanded to be shot rather than returned to the experimental laboratories. All 40 prisoners involved in the escape attempt were eventually captured and killed, but their defiance demonstrated that the human spirit could not be entirely crushed even under the most extreme circumstances. The scale of Unit 731's operations extended far beyond the main facility. Ishi's network included sister units throughout occupied China: Unit 1855 in Beijing, Unit A 1644 in Nanjing, Unit 8604 in Guangzhou, and later Unit 9420 in Singapore. At its peak in 1939, this network employed over 10,000 personnel and operated with the full support of Japan's military establishment. Medical schools in Japan regularly communicated with Unit 731, providing suggestions for experiments and receiving human tissue samples for analysis. What makes this story particularly tragic is how preventable it was. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 had already prohibited the use of biological weapons in warfare. The international medical community had established clear ethical guidelines for human experimentation. Yet Unit 731 operated for over a decade with the full knowledge and support of Japan's government, military, and medical establishment. As we delve deeper into this dark chapter of history, we begin to understand that Unit 731 wasn't an aberration or the product of a few sadistic individuals. It was a systematic program that reveals what can happen when scientific curiosity becomes divorced from human compassion, when medical expertise serves political power rather than human welfare, and when entire societies convince themselves that certain groups of people are less than human. The victims of Unit 731 came from all walks of life. They were farmers and shopkeepers, students and laborers, parents and children. They had names, families, dreams, and fears. But within the walls of this facility, all of that was stripped away. They became nothing more than data points in research reports, raw material for weapons development, and ultimately casualties in humanity's capacity for evil. Children represented some of Unit 731's most vulnerable victims, yet they received no special consideration from their captors. Infants born to imprisoned mothers were either killed immediately after birth or subjected to the same experimental protocols as adults. Young children showed different physiological responses to disease infections, making them valuable research subjects in the eyes of Unit 731's scientists. They were forced into gas chambers while researchers timed their convulsions. During centrifuge experiments designed to simulate the effects of high G-forces on pilots, children demonstrated lower tolerance levels than adults, often losing consciousness or dying at lower rotational speeds. The reproductive experiments conducted at Unit 731 reveal perhaps the most depraved aspects of the facility's operations. Female prisoners of childbearing age were forcibly impregnated specifically to serve as test subjects for weapons and trauma research. These pregnant women were then infected with various diseases exposed to chemical agents, and subjected to crash injuries and gunshot wounds. Researchers would monitor the effects on both mother and fetus before performing live dissections to examine the internal damage. When injection methods proved insufficient for studying sexually transmitted diseases, Unit 731 staff forced prisoners into sexual acts with each other. Syphilitic prisoners were ordered to rape other captives while researchers observed the transmission process. If initial exposure failed to establish infection, additional assaults would be arranged until the disease took hold. Victims were then monitored at different stages of infection before being vivisected to study the disease's progression through their organs. The staff's complete moral detachment becomes evident in their casual language about these atrocities. Guards referred to the infected genitals of female prisoners as jam-filled buns, treating human suffering as a source of crude humor. Multiple guards later blamed the female victims themselves for being hosts of diseases, even though these women had been forcibly infected through systematic rape orchestrated by their captors. Weapons testing at Unit 731 treated human beings as living targets for calibrating military equipment. Prisoners were tied to stakes at various distances while researchers tested the operational range of flamethrowers, grenades, and different types of shells and bombs. Victims were herded together on firing ranges and shot with Nambu pistols, bolt-action rifles, and machine guns while staff compared wound patterns and penetration depths on the bodies of the dead and dying. Bayonets, swords, and knives were studied through systematic stabbing and slashing of bound prisoners. Heavy objects were dropped onto victims to analyze crush injuries. Some prisoners were locked up and deprived of food and water, while researchers documented how long human beings could survive under these conditions. Others were forced to drink only seawater, or were given injections of mismatched human and animal blood to study transfusion reactions and blood clotting processes. The facility's X-ray equipment served dual purposes as both diagnostic tool and weapon. Prolonged radiation exposure sterilized and eventually killed thousands of prisoners, while researchers observed the effects of different radiation doses on human tissue. Large centrifuges designed to study high G-force effects on pilots became instruments of torture, spinning human subjects at increasing speeds until they lost consciousness or died from the extreme forces. What makes these experiments particularly disturbing is their often pointless nature. Many procedures served no legitimate military or medical purpose. Former staff members later testified about the playfulness of researchers who seemed driven by morbid curiosity rather than scientific necessity. One witness described experiments involving beheadings that served no apparent medical purpose whatsoever, conducted simply because researchers wondered what would happen if we did such and such. The psychological environment within Unit 731 created a complete inversion of medical ethics. Doctors who had taken oaths to preserve human life became architects of systematic murder. The facility's generous funding, luxurious working conditions, and state-of-the-art equipment attracted Japan's medical elite, who found themselves conducting research that would have been unthinkable in civilian hospitals. The combination of professional prestige, financial incentives, and nationalistic ideology created a perfect storm that transformed healers into killers. Daily life for the perpetrators followed a routine that normalized the abnormal. Staff members would arrive at work each morning, change into white laboratory coats, and proceed to torture human beings with the same methodical approach they might have used to study laboratory animals. Lunch breaks were taken between vivisection sessions. Evening discussions centered on refining experimental techniques and improving data collection methods. The banality of evil revealed itself in how ordinary people convinced themselves that extraordinary cruelty was simply professional duty. The facility's communication with medical institutions back in Japan demonstrates how deeply Unit 731 was integrated into the country's scientific establishment. University professors regularly corresponded with Unit 731 researchers, suggesting new experimental approaches and requesting tissue samples for their own studies. Medical journals published research based on data obtained through human experimentation, though the true source of this information was carefully concealed. The entire Japanese medical community became complicit in these atrocities through their willingness to accept and build upon research obtained through torture and murder. Some staff members struggled with the moral implications of their work, but institutional pressure and fear of punishment kept most from speaking out. Those who expressed doubts were reminded of their patriotic duty to advance Japan's military capabilities. Others were told that their research would save Japanese soldiers' lives by developing better treatments for battlefield injuries and diseases. These justifications allowed otherwise decent people to participate in systematic murder while maintaining their self-image as loyal citizens and dedicated scientists. The few documented resistance attempts by prisoners reveal both the courage of victims and the futility of their situation. In addition to the major escape attempt involving 40 prisoners, smaller acts of defiance occurred regularly. Some prisoners refused to cooperate with experimental procedures, preferring death to continued torture. Others attempted suicide rather than face another day of experimentation. Guards responded to such resistance with increased brutality, using the threat of more painful experiments to force compliance. The facility's record-keeping reveals the bureaucratic nature of these atrocities. Detailed logs documented every experiment, tracking prisoner identification numbers, experimental protocols, physiological responses, and time of death. These records were maintained with the same meticulous care that might characterize any scientific research program. The systematic documentation of human suffering demonstrates how easily administrative procedures can mask moral horror when institutions lose their ethical foundation. As Japan's military situation deteriorated in the final years of World War II, Unit 731's activities intensified rather than diminished. With defeat looming, researchers accelerated their experimental programs, perhaps hoping to develop some biological weapon that might turn the tide of war. The increasing desperation of Japan's military leadership translated into even more frenzied experimentation on the facility's prisoners. The complex web of dehumanization that enabled these atrocities extended beyond simple racism or nationalism. It required a systematic redefinition of what constituted human life worthy of protection. Prisoners were reclassified as research materials, their suffering reframed as scientific data, and their deaths recorded as experimental outcomes. This linguistic and conceptual transformation made possible acts that would have been unthinkable if victims had retained their status as human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. Unit 731 represents more than just a historical atrocity. It serves as a warning about the fragility of ethical constraints in scientific research and the ease with which institutional authority can override individual moral judgment. The facility's operations demonstrate how quickly civilized societies can descend into barbarism when certain groups are deemed expendable and when scientific curiosity becomes divorced from human compassion. The victims of Unit 731 died in agony, their suffering serving no legitimate purpose beyond satisfying the morbid curiosity of their tormentors. They left behind families who never learned their fate, dreams that would never be fulfilled, and stories that would remain untold for decades. Their experiences remind us that behind every historical statistic lies individual human tragedy, and that our obligation to remember extends not just to the facts of what happened, but to the personal cost of these atrocities for those who endured them. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Unit 731 faced an immediate crisis. The facility's operations had been conducted in absolute secrecy, and the approaching Soviet forces threatened to expose everything. In the weeks leading up to surrender, frantic efforts began to erase all evidence of what had taken place within those concrete walls. The destruction was systematic and thorough. Buildings were demolished, equipment was destroyed, and thousands of documents were burned. Laboratory animals infected with deadly pathogens were released into the surrounding countryside, potentially exposing local populations to diseases that had been weaponized within the facility. The remaining 400 prisoners were executed to eliminate any potential witnesses. Staff members were sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Unit 731's end was not its destruction, but what happened to its personnel. Rather than facing justice for their crimes, many of the facility's top researchers found themselves in an unexpected position of power. The United States, eager to obtain biological weapons research and prevent it from falling into Soviet hands, made a calculated decision that would haunt history. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters entered into secret negotiations with Shiro Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, these men provided detailed reports on their human experimentation programs. The United States government, despite knowing the full extent of Unit 731's atrocities, chose scientific data over justice for the victims. Ishii himself was granted complete immunity and lived comfortably in Japan until his death in 1959. Other Unit 731 researchers went on to prominent careers in Japanese medicine, academia, and pharmaceutical companies. Some became respected professors at major universities. Others founded successful medical practices. Many continued their research, now focusing on legitimate medical applications rather than biological weapons development. This post-war cover-up meant that for decades, the stories of Unit 731's victims remained buried. Unlike the Holocaust, which was extensively documented and prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials, Unit 731's crimes were deliberately hidden from public view. The American decision to grant immunity in exchange for research data meant that no international tribunal would examine these atrocities. No official record would document the suffering of those who died within the facility's walls. The silence surrounding Unit 731 had profound consequences for historical memory. While European victims of medical experimentation found some measure of recognition and commemoration, the Chinese, Russian, and Mongolian victims of Unit T-731 remained largely forgotten. Their families never learned what had happened to their loved ones. Their communities never received acknowledgement of their losses. Their suffering was erased not just by their killers, but by the international community's willingness to overlook these crimes in pursuit of strategic advantage. It wasn't until the 1980s that serious efforts began to document Unit 731's activities. Japanese journalists and historians, working against significant political pressure, started interviewing former staff members and uncovering buried documents. Chinese researchers began collecting testimonies from survivors and families of victims. Gradually, the truth about Unit 731 began to emerge from the shadows of official secrecy. The revelations were staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 14,000 people died within Unit 731's main facility, with thousands more killed at affiliated sites throughout occupied China. But these numbers represent only direct victims of experimentation. The biological weapons developed at Unit 731 were deployed against Chinese civilian populations, causing plague outbreaks that killed tens of thousands of additional people. The human cost extended beyond immediate deaths. Families were destroyed when breadwinners disappeared into Unit 731's black vans. Communities were devastated by biological weapons attacks that left survivors traumatized and entire regions economically disrupted. The psychological impact on those who witnessed these attacks, who lost family members to mysterious diseases, or who lived in constant fear of Japanese biological warfare, created lasting trauma that affected multiple generations. Perhaps most troubling is what Unit 731 reveals about human nature under extreme circumstances. The facility's operations required the active participation of hundreds of people and the passive complicity of thousands more. Doctors, nurses, laboratory technicians, guards, administrators, and support staff all played roles in this system of systematic murder. Most were ordinary people who had not previously shown signs of unusual cruelty or sadism. The transformation of these individuals from healers and scientists into perpetrators of mass murder demonstrates how institutional authority and group pressure can override personal moral judgment. When surrounded by colleagues who treated human experimentation as routine scientific work, when operating under orders from respected military and medical authorities, when isolated from outside ethical constraints, ordinary people became capable of extraordinary evil. The facility's victims also demonstrated remarkable courage and dignity in the face of unimaginable horror. Despite being stripped of their names, their freedom, and ultimately their lives, many prisoners maintained their humanity until the end. They comforted fellow captives, shared scarce resources, and in some cases sacrificed their own welfare to help others. Their resistance, whether through escape attempts, refusal to cooperate with experiments, or simple acts of kindness toward fellow prisoners, represents the enduring power of human compassion even under the most dehumanizing conditions. Today, the site of Unit 731 serves as a museum and memorial. Visitors can walk through reconstructed prison cells, examine preserved laboratory equipment, and read testimonies from both victims and perpetrators. The museum's exhibits provide detailed documentation of the facility's operations, drawing on decades of research by historians from multiple countries. But the memorial also serves a broader purpose. It stands as a reminder that the capacity for both great evil and great good exists within human societies. The same scientific knowledge that enabled Unit 731's atrocities also provides the foundation for modern medicine's ability to heal and save lives. The same institutional structures that facilitated systematic murder also enable contemporary medical research that benefits humanity. The lessons of Unit 731 extend far beyond its historical context. In our current era of rapid technological advancement and increasing global connectivity, the ethical questions raised by Unit 731 remain profoundly relevant. How do we ensure that scientific research serves humanity rather than destroying it? How do we prevent institutional authority from overriding individual moral responsibility? How do we maintain respect for human dignity in systems that treat people as resources to be managed rather than individuals to be respected? The victims of Unit 731 cannot be brought back to life. Their suffering cannot be undone, their families cannot be reunited. But their stories can serve a vital purpose if we allow them to inform our understanding of human nature and guide our choices about how societies should be organized and how scientific research should be conducted. The silence that surrounded Unit 731 for decades after the war demonstrates how easily atrocities can be forgotten when it serves the interests of those in power. The facility's victims were denied justice not because their suffering was unknown, but because acknowledging it proved inconvenient for post-war political arrangements. This deliberate forgetting represents a second injustice inflicted upon people who had already endured unimaginable cruelty. But memory, once recovered, can serve as a powerful force for preventing future atrocities. The documentation of Unit 731's activities provides clear evidence of where unconstrained scientific research can lead when divorced from ethical oversight. The testimonies of both victims and perpetrators offer insights into how ordinary people can be transformed into agents of systematic cruelty, and how others can maintain their humanity under the most extreme circumstances. Understanding Unit 731 requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. It forces us to acknowledge that civilization's restraints on cruelty are more fragile than we might prefer to believe. It demonstrates that education, professional training, and social status provide no guarantee against moral corruption when institutional pressures and group dynamics encourage evil behavior. Yet the story of Unit 731 also reveals human capacity for resistance, courage, and moral clarity even under the most oppressive circumstances. The prisoners who attempted escape, who refused to cooperate with their tormentors, who maintained compassion for fellow victims, demonstrated that human dignity can endure even when everything else has been stripped away. The facility's victims were farmers and merchants, students and laborers, parents and children. They came from different countries, spoke different languages, and held different beliefs. But within Unit 731's walls, all of these differences became irrelevant. They shared a common humanity that their captors had chosen to ignore, and they faced a common fate that their tormentors had decided to impose. Their stories remind us that behind every historical statistic lies individual human experience. The number 14,000 represents 14,000 separate lives, 14,000 unique stories, 14,000 irreplaceable losses. Each victim had hopes and fears, relationships and responsibilities, dreams that would never be fulfilled, and contributions that would never be made. We cannot undo the past, but we can choose how to remember it. We can honor the victims of Unit 731 by ensuring their stories are told, their suffering is acknowledged, and their experiences inform our understanding of both human cruelty and human resilience. We can use their legacy to strengthen our commitment to human dignity, scientific ethics, and the protection of vulnerable populations. The wooden logs that gave Unit 731's victims their dehumanizing nickname have long since rotted away. But the memory of those who were treated as nothing more than experimental materials can live on if we choose to preserve and learn from their stories. In remembering them, we affirm that every human life has value that cannot be reduced to scientific data, political utility, or military advantage. Unit 731 stands as one of history's darkest chapters, but it also serves as a testament to the importance of bearing witness to human suffering and learning from humanity's gravest mistakes. The victims deserve nothing less than our complete commitment to ensuring that such atrocities never happen again.